Assalamu alaikum. You're listening to the New Beginnings podcast. No fluff, no holding back, just honest conversations about your journey as a new Muslim.
Brought to you by New Beginnings, a platform that aims to support new Muslims on their journey through Islam, from the Shahada and beyond.
Later on, as time went on, I got involved with the New Muslim Project. Well, I got involved with Markfield, with the New Muslim Islamic Foundation in Markfield, and got involved with an organisation called the Islamic Society of Britain. And I was the chairman of the Islamic Society of Britain. And we had a meeting to set up the New Muslim Project, which we did. The meeting was chaired by Yusuf Islam. We set up the New Muslim Project. So I got very involved in that. And this issue of fiqh was a burning passion of mine. And I started speaking regularly with Sheikh Darsh, who was the Imam of the Central Masjid in London. And I posed him this question about following one particular madhab. And he advised me to always search for the closest to the Sunnah, from whichever madhab it was from, because not all the practice of all the four madhabs may suit your understanding and your mindset. And because Sharia law and fiqh was important to me, like I said right from the start, I'm very much a pragmatist. That's what I started to do. So I then became known in Blackburn as Ilyas, the Ghair Mukhalid, because I didn't follow any madhab. And I've never followed one single madhab ever since, although I would never decry people who do, because I think that the madhabs give you a very simple, straightforward way to understand Islam. And I think that madhabs are sort of a link between Muslim brothers and sisters. For example, if you pray in a particular way that is not according to the way Hanafis pray, and you go into one of their mosques, they will look at you like you're a spaceman. So that can create mischief and problems. And one of the things that we did early on in the New Muslim Project, when we used to teach, we should train the trainers. We would train people that this is how you pray. This are the differences between salat in the actions of the four imams, if there are differences between all four. But if you live in a Bengali Hanafi area, please join the congregation with the understanding that they will understand you. So that's my personal opinion. Definitely for anyone who just embraced Islam, stick with the madhab that your local community is. Learn about all four madhabs. Why not? And you may be shocked. I remember talking to a Saudi brother when I lived there about this idea. And I said, what madhab do you follow? And he said, we follow Abdul Wahhab with a smattering of Ibn Taymiyyah. And I thought that was about right, because following one to perfection can be difficult. A friend of mine, he was brought up in the Al Shatila camp, which is a big refugee camp in South Lebanon. And what they used to do in the 70s, they used to drop toys from airplanes, and they used to explode. So he had a friend who had his hands blown off by one of these toys. So he was strict Shafi in his madhab, but because he couldn't complete wudu because he had no hands, his wife had to help him do wudu. Now under Imam Shafi, his wudu would be null and void because he'd been touched by his wife, by a woman. So he used to follow Abu Hanifa's rulings on wudu, just for wudu, but for everything else, Shafi. So it's like anything else. One shouldn't be rigid and put yourself in a box. It's important to be flexible and open-minded, even when it comes to the madhabs. And it's also important to understand not only the madhabs, but also understand the 6 major books of hadith and where they slot into fiqh and the evolution of fiqh.
Jazakallah khair for that insight. I mean, my own personal journey with following a school of thought has been, if I'm honest, it's been confused, because I was in a community that claimed to not follow any school of thought, but which in fact was quite strictly following the Shafi school. And so I was going along thinking that, no, I don't follow a madhab, but in fact I was. But now, because it was presented to me like that, and this is, going back a couple of decades, it made me think again, and this is where the literalist comes in, that there's a right way and a wrong way. And seeing people doing things differently, to my mind, meant, ooh, that's wrong. And it took quite a bit of education for me to realize that no, they're actually all right. That there isn't, the differences aren't in core matters. Even when you're talking about praying, right? Your pillars of prayer are the same. The things that you have to do when you're praying are the same. The differences come in where you put your hands, how you wiggle your finger, how, sometimes slight differences in the du'as that you say in different places, none of which are essential elements of your prayer, just saying an example. But this was something that, as a new Muslim, was never explained to me. And it took me a long time and a lot of reading and a lot of learning to sort of understand this. But another thing that I observed was, and this is particularly with regards to the Hanafi school of thought, perhaps because the South Asian community is the biggest community in the UK, and the vast majority of them follow the Hanafi school. And they will say, we are Hanafis. They're quite aware of the fact that they follow the Hanafi school. However, not all of them are very literate in the Hanafi school. It's being passed down to them, as you said, Brother Ilyas, from father to son, from parents to children, oftentimes tangled up with cultural ideas, presented as, this is Hanafi. And I have heard people say things to me directly, we don't do it that way because we're Hanafi, when talking about something that has nothing to do with fiqh, or has nothing to do, or does have to do with fiqh, but isn't actually part of Hanafi school. And it was only like this past year when I've been actually taking classes in Hanafi fiqh that I've realized, now hang on, none of my friends who are Hanafi would say that this is what they think, this is how they practice. And it's quite eye-opening to see that, when you actually delve into it academically, there is so much cultural misinformation tangled up with our schools of thought. And it can actually give them a bad name. Like, my impression, for example, of, let's take one of the four, Maliki, is that it's excessively strict, right? And people who I know who have come from communities that practice, according to the Maliki school, will have very sort of strict mindsets, and you have to do it this way. But it's got nothing to do with the school of thought itself. It's to do with the culture that it exists in. With the Hanafi school as well as the Shafi school, there was a lot of things that were presented to me as, well, we do it this way because of Shafi, the Shafi fiqh says this and that. And it was actually just a toxic mindset being excused through putting a label on it. So this is another thing to be aware of when you actually go and academically study one of these schools of thoughts. Number one, the differences are very little, but also number two, a lot of the things that you think might be problematic in a school actually aren't there and actually don't exist. And I sort of regret the fact that it's taken me this long to realize this, because I did have some preconceptions, admittedly. Sheikh Bilal, what would you have to say about this topic?
Yeah, I think what you both said is very spot on. I don't like to call them schools of thought because it seems to indicate there's a difference in ideology or something. They're more like different schools of legal practice, per se. And within a school, you'll find that the rulings and the way that it's practiced may even differ in different cultures. So the Shafis in East Africa, they're not the same as the Shafis in Malaysia, for example. And they might follow different opinions within the school. They're still Shafis, but you'll find there's a difference. The Hanafis in India, they're not the same as the Hanafis in Syria. The Hanbalis in Saudi, they're not the same as the Hanbalis in Egypt. Okay, so you'll find all of these differences. And like Amanda said, the culture of that area may decide how strict the people are in following certain rulings that they see to be from the school or not. But there are 4 schools, and all of them are fine to follow, because these jurists didn't disagree about fundamental aspects of the religion. They just didn't disagree about doctrine or belief. It was just a disagreement about practical aspects, which are not absolutely clear-cut in the religion. And if everything was absolutely clear-cut in the religion, it would be very difficult for us to follow, like Ilyas mentioned, with the boy who didn't have any hands and his wife had to make wudu. So if there was only one way of doing something, it would be very, very difficult to follow. So we have great flexibility, and even though somebody might be following a school, they may not be able to follow every single ruling in that school, and will definitely have to, jump to another school at some point in their lives. And we spoke about Sufis and Salafis as well. Some Salafis, they do follow a school. Okay, some of them choose not to. Sufis, they generally follow school, but you'll find that how strict are they actually following the rules of that school when it comes to certain practices? You'll find that they deviate as well. So within those different methodologies, they will follow the school to a certain extent. So for us as converts, like Ilyas mentioned, just stick to what you're being taught. When you convert to Islam, your school is a person who's teaching you how to pray, who's teaching you how to pay zakat. That's your school. And that's it. And these schools of law, we find that it's not about people following what's closer to the Sunnah. I think that was an incorrect statement. When people say, I'm following the Maliki school because it's closer to the Sunnah. Ridiculous. First, you'd have to know what all of the schools say in order to make that judgment, because you're saying that Maliki is going to be closer than Hanbali, Shafi. It means you know all of the schools and everything they say, and it means you actually know what the Sunnah is, and you know all of the Hadith and all the verses of the Quran. So it's a ridiculous statement. People follow these schools out of convenience, out of expediency. It's, if you're born in Algeria, I'm quite sure you'd be following the Maliki school. If you were living in rural Pakistan, you don't have any other choice. You're going to learn the Hanafi school and so on. So it's a lot of these differences, they're based on geographical location. So you as a convert to Islam, the important thing, like Amanda said, is to sit and learn, at least learn one of them. So you know how to practice your religion, but try not to get confused. These are not sects. They're not based on doctrine or theology. They're just different ways of practicing. So like a house with 4 rooms, any room you enter will get you to Jannah. And Imam Shafi there's a beautiful quote attributed to him that he used to say that my opinion is correct. There's a possibility of it being incorrect. And your opinion is incorrect. There's a possibility of it being correct. So nobody should have this strict adherence to these schools, thinking that this is the only way to practice Islam and this is the only correct way of doing things. That's not right whatsoever. And we know from the hadith of the Messenger of Allah that he said that if a judge gives a ruling and he tries his best to give a ruling and he's correct, then he will get 2 rewards. And if he tries his best and gives a ruling and he's incorrect, he'll get 1 reward. It's the same thing with the founders of these schools. All of them will be acceptable with Allah.
Jazakallah khair for that clarification. One thing, I want to tell a funny story about madhab hopping. In 2018, I was invited to go for Umrah, for the Lesser Pilgrimage in Mecca, and it was December, so it was incredibly busy and incredibly crowded. And as I've said, just sort of by default, how my life turned out, I have always learned the Shafi school of thought. And in that school of thought, if you have skin-to-skin contact with your spouse, or physical contact with any non-mahram relative, your wudu is broken. Try making tawaf in December without having any physical contact with total strangers all around you in every direction. It's impossible. And before we actually started making our tawaf, the imam of our group, who was Palestinian, and so also Shafi, actually addressed the group, and we were all converts. And he said, if any of you here are Shafi, don't worry about it for now. And we were all just like, immediately, those of us who knew exactly what he was talking about. We're like, okay, good. Alhamdulillah. He's like, this is your exception to the rule about your wudu. And as we were making tawaf, I was thinking, Alhamdulillah, thank God he said that, because you would have had to leave and go and renew your wudu every 2 seconds otherwise. It would have been literally impossible. It was so crowded. So, this is part of as you said, the mercy of this difference of opinion, that there is this flexibility that we can adapt to depending on the situation. And as Brother Ilyas said, with the brother who didn't have hands, subhanAllah.
One of the things I find is that the general followers and adherents to these schools, they seem to be stricter in following that school than the actual scholars are. So, I was reading a Hanafi text, which is a few hundred years old, and there's a great scholar of the Hanafi school, Ibn Abidin, and he was speaking about combining prayers on travel. And he was saying, obviously in the Hanafi school, you can't combine your prayers with the excuse of travel, like combining Zohar and Asr and Maghrib and Isha. And they were saying, actually, we're going to follow the Shafi school in this ruling just to make it easier for us. And they actually would practice that themselves. So even the scholars and adherents of those schools themselves, they didn't follow the school so strictly. So why are you doing it?
Actually, that's an important issue to bring up, because there are those who say in our communities, and I think, as you said, if you're born in a Muslim majority country, you will just naturally fall into whatever the madhab, whatever the school of thought is in that country. So if you're in Turkey, you'll be Hanafi, or Pakistan, you'll be Hanafi, Palestine, you'll be Shafi, and so on. But when we get to the UK, where our community is made up of immigrants from a variety of countries, plus converts who, at the start, we don't have a clue. This is where it becomes a question. But there are those people, those individuals, who will say that, oh, well, following a madhab is blind following, and we shouldn't be blind following. We should look into it ourselves and so on. And yet these people themselves, in fact, follow a madhab in a sense. They follow a school of thought, or they follow a scholar, and sometimes quite blindly. So if one of our newer brothers or sisters has decided that they're going to study the Maliki school, that's what they're going to practice because that's what their in-laws do, and then they come across somebody who says, you're praying wrong, and that's blind following, how can we deal with this kind of a comment?
I think it's important to understand that not everybody is gifted with the opportunity or the intellect to study Islam in a depth. There are people who embrace Islam who are just Joe Blogs, no education, no GCSEs, no levels. Everybody has a right to find a way to Allah. So whether that brother makes mistakes or doesn't make mistakes, whether he learns just by blind following from the people in his community, I think it's important that he has that opportunity and is given the confidence to learn. Because you can't become Muslim and then within a year know everything there is about Abu Hanifa, his life works and everything that's written about him and all the different ways of cultural practices of that particular madhab. So I think as converts, we have to have pretty thick skins and we have to carry on regardless. Yes, we have to learn. Yes, we have to progress. But if we can't, or if we make mistakes, it's between Allah and ourselves. If we find that one particular madhab is not for us and we move geographical areas and we have to learn about another madhab, be prepared to do that. Be prepared to be dynamic in your deen, in your understanding, be dynamic in your life as a Muslim. And I think that this idea that you're wrong if you blind follow a madhab, but we're all blind following Allah. We're all blind following the sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. I have never seen Allah. I have never seen the Prophet ﷺ. And I'm blind following. And I blind follow the sunnah as best I can. And I blind follow fiqh as best I can. And I think it's important to understand, as Brother Bilal said, that the madhab teachings differ geographically. Imam Shafi, for example, gave one ruling in Cairo and then gave a different ruling in Alexandria. And when he was questioned about it, he said the people of Alexandria are different from the people of Cairo. Just as the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, gave different rulings about whether you can touch your wife in Ramadan, whether it breaks your fast or not, depending on your age and your sexuality. So I think to understand that Islam is not a prescribed set of rules. Islam is not a box to put yourself in. That Islam is as dynamic as your personality. Learning about and practicing Islam is as dynamic as your personal spiritual needs. And I think we have to understand that. You can't take Shahada one day and be perfect the next day. Nowadays, you can use Sheikh Google and you can get fatwas that suit you, but try to stick to what is best for you and your family and your future, because you're not just a Muslim today. When you take Shahada, you become the first in a whole nation of Muslims. And this is one of the things that the Sahabas had very clearly in their head. When they used to go to battle, they used to come off battle knowing that they had probably killed 20, 30 people who were potentially Muslim. And from that one individual, however long Allah decides, there will be thousands, if not millions, of offspring who are now Muslim. I'm the first Foy in my family to become Muslim. Most of my family, my mum, dad, whatever, either atheist or Christian. But my children and my children's children and children's children are Muslim because I became Muslim. And I think we have to have that reality in our head that it's not a here today, gone tomorrow. Islam is not for Christmas only.
Islam is for life, not just for Christmas. Isn't that the advert? So just steering the conversation a little bit more, we've got various groups that exist within the UK and also globally, which, Brother Ilyas, you've mentioned a few of them. Terms like Diobandi, I'm not even sure how to pronounce, Brelvi, Ikhwani, we've touched on Sufi already, Tablighi, Wahhabi, Hizb ut-Tahrir. Are there any others? There used to be Al-Muhajirun, but they've been kicked out now. Jamati. There's a lot of different terms. And I think we could probably write a book on each one. In fact, I've seen books written on each one of these. How can we just give a brief overview of what these are? Sheikh Bilal, do you want to kick us off?
I think the call warning for the UK, which may help people navigate situations, is Deobandi Barovi. So these are two polemical groups that originate from India. This before the creation of Pakistan and Bangladesh. And the founders of these two different schools and methodologies were at odds with one another in India. And the founder of the Barovi movement, his name is Ahmed Raza Khan, he actually labelled some of the teachers of the Deobandi school, which was in India, as disbelievers for certain reasons. They both Hanafis, they both from India, they both follow the same doctrine. The Maturidis or Asharis in belief. They're both Sufis as well. They were both Sufis as well. But this has caused a massive rift in India, which has continued today. And because a lot of Muslims in the UK are from India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, you actually find that there are still tensions between these two groups as well. Still, for example, there was a Syrian brother who came over, when the war in Syria began. He came to the UK and I was speaking to him. And he moved to an area and he started to work in an area where there are Deobandis and Brelvis. Usually you'll find there's two different mosques in the same area. So he went to pray at one mosque and decided to pray at another mosque. And he said, somebody came up to me. He said, what? He was asking me, what? I've never experienced this before. In Syria, we just pray anyway. He said, somebody came up to you. I prayed in one mosque for Zuhr and I prayed at a different mosque for Asr. And he said, somebody came up to me and said, oh, brother, you can't pray at a different mosque. You have to stick to one mosque. You've prayed at that mosque and you can't go to the other mosque and pray there. You need to start, so one was a Deobandi mosque, one was a Brelvi mosque. And, somebody pointed this out to him. So there are tensions between the two. Whenever people ask me to say it's not my problem, I'm a convert to Islam, that's a problem that started off in India and it's got nothing to do with me.
Would you say it's mainly a political thing again?
Yeah, you could say.
I mean, you're saying that they're both, so they follow the same school of law. They have the same belief, the same theology.
Core theology, yeah.
Core theology, okay. So what is the difference between the two then?
It was the founder of one of the schools considered the founders of some of the others as disbelievers for certain statements that they made.
And that kicked it off.
So it just kicked it off, and it's just that they are so close to each other in practice and everything, but these differences.
So perhaps for our purposes as converts, it's just good to be aware that these exist.
Yeah.
And not to get involved or take sides.
Yeah.
As you said, it doesn't concern us. Brother Ilyas, do you have something to interject?
Yeah, the way it was explained to me was that if you go to a Deobandi mosque, you'll see above the minbar Allah, Ya Allah, and Muhammad. Yeah, Ya Arabic means here. Yeah, so you can say Ya Allah, but you can't say Ya Muhammad because Muhammad is not here. Whereas if you go into a Brelvi mosque, they will have Ya Allah and Ya Muhammad. So a lot of the difference comes with how much they revere the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. Yeah, I personally would say that the Brelvi ideology is a bit Roman Catholic, whereas the Deobandi ideology is a bit more Anglican, if you can put them in those sort of terms. And it's definitely true that when you speak to I was once criticised by a Brelvi brother because I didn't pray a particular sunnah after a Farad Salat. And I said, why are you criticizing me? And he said, because you don't love the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him. You don't love the Prophet because you can't pray his sunnah. And he was very irate and very angry at that. And what I've found from being with brothers that are from that sort of background, that's normal and fine. May Allah bless them and all who sail with them. It shouldn't be something that we should get hung up on. There are differences, yes, but they're their differences. They're not our differences. If you embraced Islam in a Brelvi mosque, you may find what we class as Deobandi or Ali Hadith or whatever as very strange. If you embrace Islam in a Deobandi mosque, the same, because for some reason, this animosity is still around today from history. You will find that people from Brelvi mosques will call Deobandis and anybody else Wahhabis, which is a problem because they're not. Most Deobandis have no idea who Abdul Wahhab was anyway. So, but it's all to do with certain practices and certain positions they have on the status of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, that they have that Deobandis, Ali Hadith, whatever, don't have. And I think just to be aware of it is one of those things, but don't get hung up on it.
Yes, very important. Now you brought in another term, so we're going to skip to that term, which is the Wahhabi.
Yeah, the Wahhabi, that's a strange term. I don't know whether there are really Wahhabis. I've met people who revere Abdul Wahhab and his teachings and his only reasonable book, which is the Book of Tawheed, as the doctrine of all doctrines. They will say that Kitab al-Tawheed is the best book ever written. And they will say that Abdul Wahhab was right in all of the things that he did. And his followers today are right in all the things that they do. And this is very much from a geographical area of the Najd, which is in Saudi Arabia, and it's where the royal family come from. And the Ibn Saud originally supported Abdul Wahhab and gave him the army that he needed to do the so-called reforms that he did at the time. Some people say that he ruined Islam. Some people say that he killed people with no justification whatsoever. Some people say that his teachings were the heretic teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah. What you will hear on the streets, though, this term Wahhabi, it just refers to the Deobandis from the Brelvis. And if you want to read about Abdul Wahhab, you need to read in depth from neutral sources, because there are some very biased sources that unveil the teachings of Abdul Wahhab and his practices.
I think in the South Asian context, Wahhabi is almost always used as a derogatory term.
Yes.
Whereas in the Arab context, it's used as a synonym for Salafi.
Yes.
And that mainly because of subhanAllah, the state of Saudi Arabia and the House of Saud adopted his teachings, Abdul Wahhab's teachings, and then were blessed with fabulous wealth because of the discovery of oil. And so were able to promote his teachings globally. So it's funny how there are some people who will refer to themselves unironically as Wahhabis, as a synonym for Salafi, but then in another context, it's seen as a really derogatory term.
They still do, right? Jamiat Imam in Riyadh churns out so-called Wahhabi da'is. Every year they take in 300 Chinese Muslims, 300 Indonesian Muslims, 300 Malaysian Muslims, and they teach them, indoctrinate them, and then send them back as da'is to their own country. I personally see that as a problem, because I do have issues with that extreme ideology. But that's what happens. And like you said, they can afford it. They have the money to be able to do that.
They do. One thing too, though, to be aware of as Muslims in the UK, and we are under the whole Muslim community, not just converts, but the whole of the Muslim community, we are under a bit of a microscope in terms of security because of the way that the world is running right now. And the term Wahhabi is often used by mainstream media as a synonym for extremist. And I found this through the work that I do in my day job, a lot of newspapers using this term Wahhabi Islam, extremist Wahhabi Islam. And I do take exception to that because there are people who say that they follow the Wahhab, his methodology, who are as far from an extremist as you can get. And we'll talk a little bit about the types of terms that non-Muslim organizations will seek to label Muslims with. But I think that's something for people to be aware of. It can be seen as a derogatory term. It is not necessarily derogatory. In fact, this movement exists. It comes out of Saudi. It's very well funded, and it can be a synonym for Salafi. The next one on the list is Ikhwani. Sheikh Bilal, could you tell us what is Ikhwani? I have personal experience of it, so I'm going to back out.
I think Ilyas has more experience with them than I do. I have sat in, the circles. So Ikhwan al-Muslimin, they're called Ikhwan al-Muslimin, which means the Muslim Brotherhood. So they were formed in 1928 by Hassan al-Banna, and they're more of a political movement. So the goal is to achieve the implementation of Islam at every single level of life, including the political sphere as well. So there shouldn't be any aspect of Muslim society where Islam is being implemented. So that's the general background to it. And again, with the Ikhwani movement, the Muslim Brotherhood movement, you'll find that amongst them there are Sufis, there are Salafis, there are people from different methodologies that adhere to, that group. Some of our teachers in Syria, they were Sufis, they were Ikhwani as well. So it's not that Ikhwanis are from this group or that group. It's an idea and it's a methodology. But Ilyas, I think, has more experience than I do.
Yeah, I suppose so. I sort of fell into that ideology simply because I don't believe that politics and religion are separate. I see the Quran not only as a spiritual book, but I see the Quran also as a political book. I see the Seerah not only to teach us about spirituality and how to get close to Allah, but the Seerah teaches us also how to govern people, how to make the right decisions, how to put people before yourself, as do all the four madhabs. I think that the whole idea of fiqh and Islamic jurisprudence are about how you manage societies. So I sort of fell into that train of thought because it's second nature to me. I don't think you can separate spirituality and religion. They go hand in hand. Because if you can't create the environment for Muslims to survive and Muslims to thrive, then you're doing a disservice to Islam. I fell into it simply because I was asked to go to see a housing project at Gresham Street Mosque in Brixton to basically see how the project was going on and whether it was useful to the people of that area. And I spoke to a friend of mine who was a Libyan brother, and he said, well, I'm going down to a meeting tomorrow at Markfield of a new organisation called the Islamic Society of Britain. So what we'll do is we will go down to Markfield tomorrow, and then we'll go on to London. We'll stay in London, and we'll go to Gresham Street. I said, yeah, fine. So I went to this meeting, and in this meeting were leaders from WAMI, which is the World Association of Muslim Youth, Young Muslims UK, which is was at the time an offshoot of the UK Islamic Mission. There were direct leaders from Jamaat Islami Pakistan, Jamaat Islami Bangladesh. There were people from Rabita. There were people from Forces. There were a few converts. And the meeting was all about setting up a new organisation called the Islamic Society of Britain, which was basically a home for the old people of Young Muslims UK to go to. Because once you're no longer a young Muslim, what do you do? What do you do with yourself? And it was one of the most enlightening meetings I've ever been to, because it was all about creating a just society, about creating a society based on the Quran and the Sunnah, which is exactly what Hassan al-Banna was on about. And to me, it was the good side of politics and religion. So I got involved, I got on board, and I worked with Jamaat Islami Pakistan, Bangladesh, with WAMI, with Forces, particularly with Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Europe, Brother Kamal al-Bawi, and we planned dawah strategies and political strategies within the realms of what's possible in the UK. And that generally comes under the term, for derogatory purposes, as Hizbi, not to be confused with Hizb ut-Tahrir or the Muhajirun, which are also a political movement. Hizb ut-Tahrir in this country are a political movement trying to recreate the Khilafah. What they say is that we can't follow British law, we can only follow Islamic law when we have a Khilafah. However, in Palestine, in Al-Quds, Hizb ut-Tahrir are a different political organisation, which are not part of Ikhwan al-Muslimin. They're a separate organisation altogether and shouldn't be confused with Ikhwan. For me, Ikhwan is a good way of trying to prepare the ground for the future, because Hassan al-Banna's ideas of feeding the poor, of opening hospitals and orphanages and institutions which are at the foundation of what Muslim communities need. You know, we see in non-Muslim communities, we see hospitals, orphanages, schools, universities. But in 20th century Islam, we very rarely see those things unless we're in Muslim countries. And one of the biggest jobs of Ikhwan al-Muslimin Europe was to try and bring that about across the length and breadth of European countries, wherever there were Muslims. That ends today's part.
That entire speech was almost like a blast from my past, all of those names. I know every single person you named, but anyway. I think what's interesting too, when we talk about the Ikhwan al-Muslimin and its founder, Hassan al-Banna, it's interesting to note that he was assassinated for his teachings in Egypt. And a lot of chapters who follow, a lot of groups who follow his methodology have come under severe oppression from dictatorships in various countries, most notably in Syria. There was an entire town that was essentially, well, attacked by the dictatorship in Syria back in the 80s, was it? Hamas, was it? So, there is a whole long history there of this organization trying to implement Islam in a holistic sense socially and being beaten back for daring to try that, because, of course, that would upset the status quo. In modern terms, anybody trying to apply this methodology would probably be labeled as an Islamist, which is an incredibly problematic term, which we can touch on in a bit. It is in my list of things to talk about, a term that really doesn't have a definition, which is why it's so problematic. But thank you for sharing that, because I've had a lot of experience with organizations that claim to follow the Ikhwani methodology. Whether they do or not is another matter altogether. But, the core there of Islam being a holistic way of life, a way of life that covers every aspect, practical and spiritual, is definitely something that, when it was first presented to me as this is the Ikhwani way, I sort of thought, well, isn't that just Islam? Isn't that just how Islam is meant to be? So, Then the last one we will look at, the Tablighi Jama'ah, a group which I have zero experience of, so I will defer to the experts.
When I first became Muslim, like I said, I fell into Tabligh Jamaat. And they're a movement that has come loosely allied to Deoband. Loosely, I say.
Can I ask, for those who are uninitiated, what do the words Tablighi Jamaat actually mean?
My understanding, it means, well, some people will call it Dawah and Tabligh. So invitation to Islam and the preaching of Islam. Yeah. The word Jamaat comes because they function as a separate group within a group. They function within mosques in the UK. Headquarters is in Dewsbury in Yorkshire. And it's a movement that was originally started by Maulana Muhammad Ilyas, rahmatullah alayh, and in part why my name is Muhammad Ilyas, in recognition of the work that he did. Really, I changed my name to Ilyas, but then people started adding Muhammad to my name. So when I decided to change my name legally, I changed it to Muhammad Ilyas. And what Muhammad Ilyas used to do, he lived in a place called Uttar Pradesh, where the people there didn't know whether they were Muslims or whether they were Hindus or they were Jains or they were Sikhs or whatever they were. They didn't have a clue. Some of them had Muslim names, some of them didn't have Muslim names. And Islam was basically, or the Muslims had no recognition of their value in society or their duty in society. So what he used to do was he used to sit in the markets with Muhammad Ali Thambi, and they would smoke shisha pipe on a street corner, and they would invite people to the mosque. And they would go out to the market stalls, and they would say, how much will you earn in the next 15 to 20 minutes? And they would say, 5 rupees. So he said, I will give you 5 rupees, close your stall and come to the mosque. So that's how he started, like an outreach movement, to get people back into the mosque to understand that they're Muslims and then to become practicing Muslims. And then once he'd started in his own area, he then started going out to different areas like Lucknow and places like that. And it's very famous. One of his sayings, they do this thing called tashkil, where they try to get you to commit to going out on Jamaat, that leaving your hometown, going to another town and preaching and giving dawah in that other town. And it's very famous in his book where he said to this old man, will you come to Lucknow? And the old man said, I'm very old. I may die tomorrow. And Imam Maulana Muhammad Ilyas said, why not die in Lucknow? Basically, if you're going to die, you're going to die anyway, which was fine. And it was a movement aimed at the Muslims of India. Now, when the Muslims of India came to England, they brought that movement with them. And they set up the headquarters in Dewsbury, and they worked in mainly Deobandi mosques, some with the blessings of the local mosque and some not with the blessings of the local mosque. And they get Jamaats, groups of Muslims together, and they travel from place to place, giving dawah to Islam and preaching Islam. I was with them for about 18 months to 2 years. And for me, it was the walking madrasa, because it taught me a lot. It taught me a lot about Hanafi fiqh, or their version of Hanafi fiqh. But it also taught me the fundamentals of wudu and salat and this sort of stuff. So for me, it was the only opportunity that one had to learn about Islam. So for me, it was good. I think I was with them for 18 months and then I left them. I'll not go into the reasons why I left, but the reasons I left were quite shocking. I was actually taken aback by what's something that somebody said, and it just rocked my boat Islamically. And I thought, I can't associate myself with these people. But what they do is they read out of a book called Tabligh in Islam, or Fazal Amal, or The Teaching of Islam. It's 3 different names, same book. And it's a book of Masail Hadith, which are hadith, motivating hadith. Never been really checked for authenticity. No real isnad, no real chain of narration. And they read stories of the Sahabas, most of which are fictionalized. So it lost its appeal to me because it wasn't authentic. And I once asked, why are we visiting Muslim homes, knocking on the doors and inviting them? Should we not be giving dawah to non-Muslims? And they said, if there are 2 houses on fire, one is a non-Muslim house and one is a Muslim house, which family would you save first? And that's how they justified their existence to me. I think it's a great movement. And I think if people want to join it, fine, go ahead and join it. Take it with a pinch of salt. If you want to join it as a walk-in madrasa, fine. But like I said, take it with a pinch of salt, because half of what is taught is not authentic and is not correct. It's a very popular movement in the UK.
As I said before, I have zero experience of the Tablighi Jamaat. Just, it's how it's happened, alhamdulillah. But I had a sister reach out to me a while ago because she had seen a sister on TikTok talking about a retreat that the Tabligh does for, I think it's like over a long weekend or something like that. For women, this is specifically, because they're quite strict on their gender segregation as well, aren't they? And this sister on TikTok, young girl, she was probably about, I'm going to say 17, 18 years old. And she was talking about this amazing retreat she had been to and how it had renewed her Islam. And she showed the book that they had gone through and everything. And this convert sister reached out to me and asked, where can we do this retreat? And I thought, I haven't got the first clue where you can do this retreat. And I don't even know what this is. And in the video, the girl never actually mentioned the Tabligh Jamaat. She just said, I went on this trip. And she kept saying this word that I didn't recognize and couldn't understand. So I sent this video to a friend of mine and she was like, oh, that's a Tablighi retreat. Yeah, you can do it. And she gave me the contact of the mosque to go to. So this girl dutifully gets herself signed up for the next retreat that they do and goes along. And I knew that she was going on the Friday. She was supposed to be finished on the Sunday. On Friday night, she rang me and she was like, yeah, I've come home, because the whole thing was in Urdu and people were just staring at me. And I thought, yeah, that actually doesn't surprise me at all. And I thought that's really unfortunate, because it sounded like, in theory, such a good idea, and yet not accessible for anyone who wasn't from the in-group already. So, but yeah, the comment about the fires, oh dear. But Sheikh Bilal, now you were given da'wah by a Tablighi Jamaat, weren't you? You've said about in previous episodes.
Yes, alhamdulillah, I converted via Tablighi Jamaat, alhamdulillah. So that's one good thing they've done. It was actually another convert that was giving dawah to some of my friends who were Muslims from the Indo-Pak region, but I just happened to be in the same room, actually. So, alhamdulillah. The methodology, tabligh, it means propagation. So the idea is to propagate Islam, but like Ilyas said, they only propagate it to people who are already Muslim anyway. So they're not really giving dawah outside of that. They're just reminding Muslims of their duties that they may have neglected. So that's what the movement's really about. And
so you were not actually the target of their da'wah, you were just by the way.
Yeah, it's just I was there, but very rarely, you see them inviting people outside of the Muslim community to Islam. So that's the general gist of the methodology. And the majority of them, they will be from the Deobandi background, but you do find being practiced even in the Brahmi community as well, and other communities around the Muslim world.
Brother Ilyas, go ahead.
When I was in Tabligh Jamaat, I used to wear a suit for work. And when I came home, I would put on a thobe, an imama, and I had an asa, a big stick. And that was my attire. It was a bit like cosplay, I suppose. But that was what I did normally. And I was invited to join a group led by a man called Colonel Amiruddin Saab, who was a Pakistani with a Scottish mother, and all of his mother's relatives were missionaries in Indonesia. So he'd been in the Pakistani army, but English perfectly. And we went to Zakaria Mosque in Bolton, and he told a story, which I'll try and keep very short. He said, I was reading the New York Times the other day, and it said that Mr. Smith had married his dog. And he said, I found that story quite strange. So I read about the story, and apparently this man, Mr. Smith, lived on the 14th floor of an apartment block. And he used to go down in the morning to get his newspaper and go back up. And then he'd come down again to give the dog a walk and go back up. And that was his whole life. And he was worried that when he died, his dog would have nobody. So he married his dog so that his dog would at least have an apartment to live in or whatever. And the whole of the environment in this mosque were laughing. They thought it was the funniest thing. And then he said, then I came to thinking about whose fault it was that this Mr. Smith married his dog. And he pointed to a guy in the front row and he said, it's your fault. Then he pointed to somebody else and he said, it's your fault. Could you not travel to New York? Could you not help this individual? Could you not spread the word of Islam to this man? And suddenly the whole environment were in tears and very upset. But it took me a lesson because it really showed me that Islam is not something that we should hold on to. It's something we should share. But it also taught me another lesson because I was with a friend of mine called Harun, who was a convert. And we were both dressed in thobes with imamas and we had sticks, and that was the way we were. And at the end of the talk, he looked us both up and down, waved his hand up and down and said, Ilyas, you should be giving dawah to non-Muslims. In other words, to get this cosplay off, you don't have to dress like that to give dawah. You should be giving dawah to non-Muslims. And that was one of the learning points for me. The Tabligh Jamaat movement is definitely for Indians and Pakistanis. And even though it was banned in Saudi Arabia for many years, they've now opened the door in Saudi Arabia to Tabligh Jamaat. And they travel all over the world. In Albania, the Tabligh Jamaat have done a lot of good, making Albanian Muslims realize that they're Muslim. So they do a lot of good work. And they went to Bosnia, actually during the Bosnian War, because there was this dilemma between Bosnians as to whether they're Muslims or they were not Muslims or what they were. So they do some good work amongst the Muslim community, but they're definitely not for dawah to non-Muslims. And that's about it, really.
So before we finish today, because we are running out of time, I wanted to touch on some terms that we do find being used in the mainstream media, most of which are used as tools to sow division, as wedge-driving tactics, especially between Muslim communities, but also between Muslim communities and other communities as well. So we have terms, for example, such as extremist, fundamentalist, orthodox, conservative, moderate, and of course, as we said before, Islamist. I'd like to hear from both of you your thoughts about these terms. Sheikh Bilal, touching on the term Islamist, what would you say about this term in particular?
It's a very strange term, to be honest with you. In fact, the word actually exists in Arabic. It's Islami. Abul Hasan al-Ash'ari, who's one of the great theologians of Islam, he actually wrote a book. It's called Maqalat al-Islamiyin, the sayings of the Islamists, if you want to translate it literally. And what he meant by that is those people who are not following Sunni Islam, but have this attribution to Islam and claim to be Muslims. So the book is all about these deviant sects of Sunni Islam. So the word Islamist is, in Arabic anyway, if you say someone's an Islami, it would mean that, the person might be wrong, a sect of Islam.
And that's not remotely what it means in English. I mean, this is part of the problem in English, and this is the field that I work in, is we have this term Islamist that is undefined. If you look it up in dictionaries, it will say something like adherents of political Islam, but even that is undefined. What is political Islam? How does it differ from regular Islam's, quote, end quote? Because, again, what on earth is regular Islam? My sincere advice would be to take this word with a pinch of salt. It's often used as a stand-in word for terrorist group or for extremist group. And I think that that's unfair. And I think that it's, and I'm going to say what I'm going to say, it's designed to create an inherent link in the mind of the reader between the word Islam and what deviant groups may do and what terrorist groups may do. And that's, I do believe that is by design from the research that we've done at work. But Brother Ilyas, I'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
I think the word Islamist, like you said earlier, Ikhwan al-Muslimin would be classed as Islamist because of this understanding that Islam is not just a spiritual religion, but it is a way of life. And I think a lot of it, the way the media use it is quite simply because if you look at Christian denominations, hardly any of them support the idea of politicized Christianity. There is no such thing as a politicized Christianity. And nowadays, as we move into the 21st century, we seem to be overrun by secularism, where the whole idea of having a religion full stop is bad. But to have a religion and link it to politics is doubly bad. There are Christian fundamentalists, and there are people who actually do believe that we should get back to the laws, or not let the people design the laws of the land, but let the sources design the laws of the land, which is what they were. They were based Judeo-Christian jurisprudence, Judeo-Christian law. So they are treated derisory. But I think it's more so in the realm of Muslims, where it definitely is about politicizing Islam, which the West is obviously afraid of, because if it's not only just for the fact that we abhor riba, we abhor interest, and the whole capitalist society is based on interest. So I think there are issues. I think that we need to be careful. I know that when I was in Saudi, to link religion and the government of Saudi Arabia in one conversation, you were risking imprisonment in no uncertain terms. And my Saudi friends would not discuss politics and religion unless they were in the sauna. I had the best political discussions with Saudis in the sauna because the government doesn't bug saunas. But it is a problem. And it's not only a problem in this country. I think it's a problem globally now, where the whole idea of linking Islam and politics is something to be feared.
What you've said about secularism, I think, is really the linchpin of it, because Western societies at present are increasingly secular. And what happens with secularization is that it sort of flips things on their head. In Islam, we have the practice of our religion, the observance of our religion is a very public thing. And there are things in our way of life that are very private things. Secularism flips that upside down. What was private becomes public. Sexualization is rife in Western society, whereas what was public now becomes private, the practice of faith. And if you look at it like that, you think, okay, no wonder they don't like it. And no wonder they want to avoid it and want to avoid any sort of link between religion and politics. But the term Islamist, because there seems to be this range of understanding of it, it starts out as being anybody who believes that Islam is a complete way of life that also covers the political sphere, right up to organizations like the ones who were running rampant in Iraq and Syria a few years back, and everything in between. And there is no gradient that leads from one to the other. This is not a spectrum of understanding. They are completely different things. And yet there's this label that is being applied to all of them, which makes it seem as though there is this, if you are one, you are in danger of becoming the other. And this is why I always say to people, we need to reject this term completely. Even things like extremist, fundamentalist, conservative, orthodox, what do those mean? Orthodox means somebody who adheres to the teachings. Conservative means somebody who doesn't want to change the teachings. A fundamentalist, somebody who goes back to basics. Extremist, even on the surface of it, just means somebody who does it too much. So these are terms that are being used and twisted. Moderate is the one that does my head in the most of all, because I was once labeled as a moderate Muslim at my job. And I thought to myself, what part of me is moderate? I wear hijab, I pray 5 times a day, I fast Ramadan, I do this. I am the opposite of moderate, but because I'm not a hateful individual who's trying to force everybody else to be Muslim, I got labeled as moderate. And I thought, no, I'm just Muslim. I'm actually quite conservative. I'm actually a little bit fundamentalist if you want to, reclaim the labels from the media. But, like we said at the start, these labels are just used to divide. And as Muslims, we should never use them about ourselves, unless we're being joking and ironic, but never seriously. We should never use them as labels to judge other people with. Basically, we shouldn't play that game, is what I would say about that. Sheikh Bilal, did you want to add anything to this?
Yeah, the other thing is, if somebody uses a term like extremist, like who gets to decide what is extreme and what's not? So me praying 5 times a day might seem extreme to somebody, and there was in one of the schools in the UK where people got reported to prevent because they started praying 5 times a day. They're very, very dangerous terms, obviously there to cause division and to, be used as a tool to, attack Muslims and people who are Islamophobes. They love to use these terms. So definitely, be careful and avoid using these terms?
I think it was Dalia Mujahid, sister in America, academic, who she gave a very, very good analogy because somebody asked her, what is the difference between normal Muslims and extremist Muslims? And she instantly took exception to the word extremist because she said, if I'm making a cake and the cake recipe calls for half a cup of sugar, to be extreme would be to put in 12 cups of sugar. But that's not what these groups are doing. These terrorist groups are not putting in 12 cups of sugar. These terrorist groups are putting in 12 cups of arsenic. They are deviating from the recipe, and they're deviating from it with something that is very poisonous. So we can't say that they are extremist, because that would mean that they're doing what Islam teaches more than what regular people do. They're not. They're doing something that it doesn't teach. So even these terms, we should just reject them outright. And I liked that analogy that she gave, that this is not extreme. Extreme is doing too much of something. They're not doing too much of anything. They're doing it wrong. I think we have run over time by quite a bit. I want to thank Brother Ilyas Foy, Muhammad Ilyas Foy, officially, for giving us his time and his wisdom and imparting some of his stories on us today. It's been such an honor to hear your stories and to hear your experiences. And to all of our listeners, as always, if you have any questions about what we've discussed, or you would like to know more about these terms and these issues, please do get in touch. You can DM us on social media. We're on Instagram at Beginnings UK. There's a Facebook page as well. If you just type in the search bar, look for New Beginnings. Or you can email us on unplugged@beginnings.org.uk.
We're also on TikTok as well.
Are we on TikTok?
We're on Twitter. So Beginnings UK is the handle on all of those, and YouTube as well.
Brother Ilyas, in closing, would you like to give any words?
I think the only thing I would say is that when you embark on this journey of Islam, if you embark on this journey of Islam, or even if you're already on this journey of Islam, just keep an open mind. Keep an open mind. Look after your own heart. Look after your own intellect. And learn from authorized sources, people that can help you and not hinder you. And don't rely on Sheikh Google all the time. Actually travel. Speak to scholars. Talk to scholars. Sit at their feet and listen to what they have to say. That's the important thing.
That's it for another episode of the New Beginnings podcast. We do hope you enjoyed this episode. Please share on social media and with family and friends.
Yes, please do share and subscribe. We're on all major podcast platforms. Inshallah, we'll see you next time.
I look forward to it. But for now, thank you for listening.
Until next time, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.